may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Boys, life is crazy. Okay, so since we announced that we were taking this full time, I mean, we have had so much support over there on Patreon where my life is now a lot less stressful. I think that this was probably the right decision. So I just owe everyone a massive thank you who's decided to support the show over on Patreon, decided to join the flock, and please do not hesitate to shoot me anything you have, any questions, any teams. The reason I'm over there, the reason I'm answering questions all day and breaking down teams all day over there is because that is now my job, and I love talking fantasy football with y'all, and honestly, that's just the straight cold truth. Now, also, I need to give a massive thank you to everybody dropping likes on the videos. As you can tell, this video has timestamps on it, and that's because y'all just crushed that 250 like mark that we set every single time for the first day of videos uploaded to have the next one with timestamps. That way, even with timestamps, we're still getting recommended through the algorithm. So thank you guys. I'm going to continue to do that for y'all. Just make sure you're continuing to support the channel. Okay. So a little bit of a trigger warning here. We are going to be going through and talking about the worst case scenario for these wide receivers. Now, I'm not saying that this is the likely scenario, but we have to view fantasy football through the range of outcomes. We have to go, okay, what is the ceiling here with this player? What is the floor? And does it make sense to make that kind of risk into a player we are drafting? And I'm just trying to cover both ends of the range of outcomes. I'm just trying to make sure that we have an entire picture of what could possibly happen. That way you can try to make the best decision possible when you're deciding to draft these players. But our first guy we are going to be talking about is going to be Tyler Lockett. And if you're looking at season-long numbers, I mean, Tyler Lockett looked great in 2020. I mean, if you're looking at season-long numbers, you're going, oh crap, Tyler Lockett had 100 receptions. He did so with some decent efficiency because these targets are coming from Russell Wilson. But, I mean, it was mainly because of 2 weeks. We know that Tyler Lockett popped off 2 specific weeks in last year's NFL season. Both of them were at the beginning of the season. So if you look at the second part of the 2020 year where Tyler Lockett was just, I don't want to say disappointing, but he never lived up to those expectations. I mean, after week 8, so weeks 9 through 16, Tyler Lockett was actually the wide receiver 54 in points per game. Obviously, the wide receiver 54 is not going to be making any kind of impact for you. And if you are putting him in your lineup, trust me, like I was doing with Tyler Lockett in so many different leagues, I mean, you are just kind of behind the 8 ball because you can almost guarantee the wide receiver that your opponent started in that same slot is going to be outproducing Tyler Lockett. And now it has been a little bit of a wild ride for Tyler Lockett this offseason, where you had to be worried about Russell Wilson possibly leaving Seattle earlier, where now that is not a concern. Now it looks like Russell Wilson is locked into Seattle. It looks like they did smooth everything out. But beyond that, there are some more red flags with Tyler Lockett. Not only did you see that production just take a nosedive in the second half of the season, but also you saw this team go out and draft Eskridge in the second round. And y'all know with Dwayne Eskridge, I mean, he's a wide receiver. No, I do not like. I mean, he was a 5-year player in college that really never had the production profile that you wanted to see. And I understand he played some defensive back. I understand that he is more of a raw athlete than he is just a wide receiver. But what I want to point out is the fact that Seattle is a little bit different than some other teams. Seattle is not like the LA Rams. They are not like the Cincinnati Bengals. They are not always going to be running out 3 wide receiver sets. So a question we have to ask ourselves is, does this coaching staff still want to use Tyler Lockett as an every down player? Where I know they gave him the extension, and the likely answer to that question is yes. But we are talking about worst case scenario here. We are talking about the floor of these players. And I think worst case scenario for Tyler Lockett, you actually have DK Metcalf as the alpha wide receiver 1, which that's something you should expect. I mean, that's in the median projection. But beyond that, what happens if Dwayne Eskridge, a wide receiver, keep in mind, I definitely prefer Tyler Lockett, but what happens if Eskridge starts to steal snaps away? And we go, okay, Tyler Lockett is now going from a wide receiver that was very disappointing in the second half of the season. If he's now losing snaps, what if he is just a boom bust wide receiver 4? What if he is just like a Hollywood Brown from 2020? I mean, I think that is in the range of Tyler Lockett. Now, it's going to be a little bit harder to see given the fact that Russell Wilson is going to be so efficient that he should really raise the floor of all the pass catchers in this offense. But I want people to understand that Tyler Lockett isn't nearly the safe option as he once was. Okay, so now let's go over to a wide receiver on a team that I'm really excited about. Let's go talk about Deebo Samuel. And here with Deebo Samuel, I mean, there are a couple things working against him. The first thing we need to address is the fact that George Kittle is always going to be the number one target in this offense. The number one target is always going to be that freakish tight end, in my opinion, the best tight end in the entire NFL. It doesn't matter who the quarterback is. It doesn't matter if it's Jimmy Garoppolo, Trey Lance, but Kittle is going to be that alpha, especially in the red zone. And we know so much fantasy production, especially for those low average depth of target wide receivers like Deebo Samuel, is going to be coming in the red zone. So that's the first thing we need to address. The second thing we need to address is the fact that when they both played together, Brandin Ayuk was a significantly better wide receiver than Deebo Samuel in 2020. Now, I know that because both Brandin Ayuk and Deebo Samuel both dealt with their own injuries, that we rarely got to see them on the field at the same time. And when we did get to see them on the field at the same time, I mean, one of them was usually nicked up a bit. Usually, you never had these guys at 100%. But nonetheless, it is important to take note of the fact that not only does Deebo Samuel look like he's going to be playing in an offense where the wide receiver is never the top option, it looks like out of the own wide receiver room, Deebo Samuel isn't going to be a top option either. So now we are going with Deebo and we're going, okay, so he projects to be the wide receiver 3 in this San Francisco 49ers offense. Now, why are we going to be drafting him high in fantasy? Is it like he is just the most durable wide receiver ever? Is it like he has the best quarterback in the NFL? And the answer to both of those questions is no. Obviously, Deebo Samuel is a wide receiver that is injury prone. And I hate to say the word injury prone. I mean, so many people misuse it. A lot of people want to label a player that just suffers, say, an injury in back-to-back seasons, that even if they are completely different body parts, they want to go, okay, they're injury prone. They want to go, okay, Saquon Barkley is injury prone, where in reality, if you dive into it, I mean, it's kind of random at that point. But with Deebo Samuel, it's different. I mean, Deebo Samuel, dating all the way back to college, has been dealing with soft tissue injuries nonstop. I mean, it's kind of like an Alshon Jeffrey situation from so long ago. And another thing here is, even though I love Trey Lance, guys, I promise you, I'm going to own Trey Lance in so many fantasy leagues with the rushing upside that he possesses, and also because of all these options in the passing offense. We can't sit here and we go, okay, it looks like Trey Lance is going to be one of those rushing quarterbacks. We know with a rushing quarterback like a Lamar Jackson, like a Jalen Hurts, those guys that you can really rely on in fantasy, usually their pass catching options aren't the best. And when they are great, just say, like you possibly saw with Michael Vick and Deshaun Jackson so long ago, usually those players are the deep threats on the offense because that mobile quarterback isn't going to be looking to dump the ball off. If he does get outside the pocket, he is going to be looking far downfield for a player like Brandin Ayuk. I mean, Deebo Samuel has a hilariously low average depth of target. I mean, he runs closer to the line of scrimmage than any other wide receiver in the entire NFL. So we're looking at Deebo as the best case scenario, a wide receiver 3 on his offense that has dealt with injuries throughout his entire career, and it may not be the best fit with a quarterback coming in. So let's go over to our next guy in Jerry Jeudy. And Jerry Jeudy, I know, guys, I mean, he has a lot of talent. There's a reason why he is going high in drafts. There's a reason why a lot of people are excited. But personally, I'm looking at this situation and I'm going, this is the worst situation for a wide receiver in the entire NFL. I mean, not only do you have arguably the worst starting quarterback in the entire NFL with Teddy Bridgewater, but more importantly, you have so many other passing options in this offense where it just simply doesn't look like Jerry Jeudy is going to be able to command a 28, 29, 30% team target share, because we've seen a very talented wide receiver in a very bad NFL offense before be successful for fantasy. I mean, this is Terry McLaurin over the past 2 years. If there's really no other options in the offense, so even if the efficiency's down, if the volume's high enough, I mean, production will be there. But in the case of Jerry Jeudy, I mean, he is playing in an offense that should be very inefficient with Teddy Bridgewater or Drew Lock under center. And the other passing options in Courtland Sutton, Noah Fant, and KJ Hamler are fantastic to the point where there's no way you could expect Jerry Jeudy to have that kind of volume. So here, yes, if Aaron Rodgers comes in, the ceiling is going to be sky high for Jeudy. But if we're talking about strictly floors, I mean, Jerry Jeudy has a low one. Okay, so now let's go over to Kenny Golladay, a wide receiver that just killed fantasy teams last year, and that we really never got a solid answer on if he was going to be coming back. And probably he could have made a return, but obviously he was due for that contract this offseason, and the Detroit Lions weren't playing for anything. So it was probably a smart business decision by him to just kind of shut himself down for the rest of the season. But now he is going from a situation in Detroit where he was the clear alpha wide receiver one on the offense, and really he only had to compete for targets with Marvin Jones, and that's not much competition at all. And we can look at the fact that he had a very good quarterback in Matthew Stafford. Now he's going to New York, and this is a completely different scenario. I mean, not only do you see a significant downgrade at the quarterback position from Matthew Stafford to Daniel Jones, but also this is a team that has a decent amount of options in this offense. I mean, they did draft Kadarius Toney in the first round, and just like Dwayne Eskridge, I am not the biggest Kadarius Toney fan in the world. I promise you that. But nonetheless, they do decide to draft Toney in the first. They already have Evan Ingram, a pass-catching tight end. They bring in Kyle Rudolph. They have Sterling Shepard. They have Darius Slayton. They have a ton of pass-catching options, not to mention that Saquon Barkley, the best running back in the entire NFL, in my opinion, is going to be coming back to this offense this year, and he's going to be taking targets out of the backfield. So now Kenny Golladay is going to a scenario where, I mean, he is going to see a drop in efficiency given the fact that he has a drop in quarterback play. Throw on the fact that there's more competition in this offense, so you should see a drop in volume at the same time. And Kenny Golladay is a player that has suffered injuries in his own right, very similar to a Deebo Samuel. So everything's stacking up to say, hey, Kenny Golladay, yes, he can have a high ceiling. We can see how, it plays out that Kenny Golladay is a mid-wide receiver one in fantasy. But I do not think anybody's going to be surprised if Kenny Golladay is just a complete bust this year. Okay, so now let's go over to Robby Anderson. And here with Robby Anderson, it's very similar to what we said with Tyler Lockett at the very beginning of the video, where at the beginning of the season, Robby Anderson started off so hot. If y'all remember, it was intriguing how Matt Rule and Joe Brady decided to deploy DJ Moore and Robby Anderson, where at the beginning of the season, you had DJ Moore actually as the wide receiver that was running the deep routes, the guys that was clearing out the field, and Robby Anderson was the guy running underneath and soaking up the volume. But we saw a switch halfway through the year. Halfway through the year, we then saw Robby Anderson switch over to be that traditional field stretching option, and you did have DJ Moore going back to the role which he fit way better in. But nonetheless, Robby Anderson, his last 10 weeks, he dropped down to being a low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4 in points per game, which obviously that's not something you're wanting to chase. And now they have a new quarterback coming into town, and I know Sam Darnold and Robby Anderson have their history. I know that is something that a lot of people are going to want to get excited about, but we simply don't know how Sam Darnold is going to look in Carolina. Throw in the fact that this team decides to go and draft Terrace Marshall in the second round. Terrace Marshall out of LSU is the exact opposite of Kadarius Toney, is the exact opposite of Dwayne Eskridge, where you can get very excited about Terrace Marshall, and I really think that he is going to make an impact year one. So we're looking at it and we're going, okay, Robby Anderson, he has a quarterback change, which yes, I guess you can get excited about that QB change, but we're talking about the absolute worst case scenario here. And also they bring in a wide receiver that looks a lot more like a better version of a Robby Anderson than he does a better version of a DJ Moore. So I'd imagine Terrace Marshall is going to be taking those targets away from Anderson and picking up whatever Curtis Samuel left. All right, so now let's go over to Brandin Cooks, and nobody's going to argue this with Brandin Cooks. If you're talking about a wide receiver with a very low floor, the easiest thing to do is go to the worst team in the NFL in the Houston Texans, and clearly it's an easy case to be made on how Brandin Cooks could hit just the worst possible scenario, and that is with Deshaun Watson missing 2021. Now, if Deshaun Watson is there, we have seen historically that Deshaun Watson is going to have a fantastic yards per pass attempt. So whatever the wide receiver one is in Houston, that player should be highly efficient despite the lack of talent on the roster. Yet we don't know if Deshaun Watson's going to be playing, and we're talking about worst case scenario here. So worst case scenario, Brandin Cooks is going in there with Davis Mills. Really? Can you imagine Davis Mills starting on this team with one of the worst offensive lines in football, with having Brandin Cooks as your wide receiver one? Not to mention that Brandin Cooks is another one of these wide receivers that has that injury history. So Brandin Cooks, I mean, it's easy to see how you're just cutting him off your roster in week 3 if things go for the worst. Now, our last wide receiver we are going to be talking about is someone that we can get excited about. I mean, best case scenario is very good. Worst case scenario is very bad. This is Devonta Smith. And here with Devonta Smith, I mean, there are a few things working against him. A, he goes to the Philadelphia Eagles. We have seen time and time again that the Philadelphia Eagles have a difficult time supporting wide receivers. I know that you can blame that on the personnel, but we are looking at it and going, hey, Travis Fulgham was the wide receiver 1 in Philadelphia last year in points per game, and that was good for being the wide receiver 64. I mean, obviously, the wide receiver 64 is not something that you want on your roster. Throw in the fact that while we love Jalen Hurts for fantasy, very similar to Trey Lance, where he can just rack up so much production on the ground, we don't necessarily know what the passing volume or the passing efficiency is going to look like with Jalen Hurts under center because we don't have that large sample. And it looks like Jalen Hurts may be one of those quarterbacks like Lamar Jackson that is a little more willing to just tuck it and run than to make sure that he can do everything he can to find his wide receiver downfield. Now, the last thing we need to mention with Devonta Smith is the fact that we simply have never seen a wide receiver at the NFL level that's 166 pounds be a wide receiver 1 for fantasy. So there are a few things working against Devonta Smith. Like I said, I mean, he does have a decent prospect profile. There are things to get excited about, and best case scenario is very good for Devonta Smith. But at the end of the day, the floor is going to be really low. Now, thank you guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. I really hope y'all got something from it. Of course, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I will see y'all with the video tomorrow. Thank you so much for everyone supporting the show on Patreon. And Dominic, Jim, Carl, Jesse, Tyler, Eric, Colby, Cameron, Mike, and Marcus, thank you guys.